This is the Battle of Arsuf. It is a battle that is extremely important in the Third Crusade. It's one that most people don't really even take much into consideration, but it's a fun one. It occurred September 7th in 1191, and it's going to pit Richard I of England and part of France, the borders were a little bit interesting back then, against Saladin, who had created, as we mentioned, an empire in the Middle East and had unified all sorts of differing peoples in his Ayyubid empire. And what's going to happen is you have a situation whereby Saladin has taken over most of the Holy Land after the debacle at Hattin, where a Crusader force was tricked into going too far and was utterly demolished by the Saracens. Saladin is going to basically be in control. What's going to occur is two massive armies are going to descend on the Holy Land, led by Philip of France and Richard of England. And they are going to initially take over the city of Acre, which for us would be here. And what's going to occur is once that city was besieged and taken, a whole bunch of Muslim prisoners of war were taken. There was a lot of discussions between Richard and Saladin, and Saladin kept kind of hemming and hawing and waiting and not paying the ransom he was supposed to pay. And Richard eventually came to the belief that Saladin was just postponing so he could build up his army, and Richard had all the prisoners of war executed. This is something that you normally didn't do. So you can imagine Saladin was a little bit upset. Richard realizes that he wants to move his army to a place called Jaffa, which is a port city, and it's going to take weeks to get there. Saladin wants to stop this because if the Crusader army takes Jaffa, then they have a port city with which they can get supplies to eventually invade Jerusalem, which was the goal. And what Richard is going to do is, number one, he is minus the French king. After Acre was taken, Philip decided that he had had enough. And so he leaves. He leaves some of his forces there, but Richard is in charge of the army now. And they have to get from Acre to Jaffa. And if you tried to march there quickly, you could get there in a couple of weeks, and you would kill all of your soldiers. Because it is extremely hot, there's not a lot of water, and there's an enemy out there. So what Richard decided to do, and this is where both sides make some really smart decisions. Richard has with him about 10,000 infantry. Most of this infantry is armed with crossbows, or they have spears. That's what the bulk of that infantry is made up of. And the spearmen often carry shields. And so what they do is they either use these shields and they take their spears and stick them in the ground to defend themselves against cavalry attacks with crossbowmen behind them firing, or their army is made up of the two religious orders that we talked about earlier, the Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar. We already talked about the fact that these groups don't necessarily like each other, but they are amazing on the battlefield. This is heavy, heavy cavalry. There is about 1,200 of those total, broken into two groups. Against this, Saladin has a pretty substantial army. So far, they've proven to be unbeatable. And what they're doing is they're going to shadow this army as it's on its march. The bulk of Saladin's army is going to be cavalry. They're usually light cavalry. And they're going to use a combination of short bows or scimitars, which are curved-bladed swords. And they are light shock troops, and they're best at charging, attacking, and running away. They're super maneuverable. Right. And he has about 20,000 of these soldiers that he can work with. He's also got a substantial amount of infantry. But even a lot of these infantry are mounted. They fight sometimes without their horses. So what's going to happen? Richard has to, under all circumstances, keep his army together. Hattin proved that if his knights charged too far, they could be cut down. So they have to stick together. And so this is what he does. He follows the coast. Every morning he marches, and in midday stops because it is too hot. Basically, they look for sources of water. While they're traveling, they keep their fleet next to them, which has some of their supplies. This is protecting their flank, being next to the water. They put their baggage train next to the water also to protect it. If you lose your food and water in the desert, you're going to be in trouble. So they're heading toward the city of Arsuf. Now, like I said, this is going to take weeks to do. And they're marching at the speed of a person walking, because half of the army, more than half of the army, is on foot. And Richard has to keep them together. He separates the Templars and the Hospitallers because, number one, they don't like each other, and number two, they're his best warriors. So he's got them in the front, and he's got them in the rear as they're moving in this direction. Now, what Saladin wants to do, which is smart, he wants to send his men in periodically to harass them. What he wants is he wants these guys to charge. He wants to anger them so they break ranks, they lose their infantry protection, and then they can be surrounded. That's what Saladin wants. This is the opposite of what Richard wants. Richard wants to keep them together. So he marches his men in tight formation every morning, marching. This is hard to do. It's also a lot slower. So it's going to take a long time to get where you want to get to. But if he maintains this, he's going to be okay. Saladin can't allow this to happen. The problem is, you can see each other. There's parts of this desert that are treeless. And so you can send out scouts and you know exactly where Saladin is, and Saladin knows exactly where Richard is. And so it makes it tough to maneuver. Saladin knows the territory though. He knows that as you get close to the city of Arsuf, there's a section of trees. And these trees last for about 12 miles. And so what Saladin is going to do, which is a brilliant move, he's going to move his army here to shield them. Right, this is his cavalry. Initially, these infantry guys are here too. And he's going to wait until Richard gets about halfway across. And then he is going to charge in and attack. Now, Richard expects this because he sees the trees coming. And Richard, who is known as Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, keeps his troops together. He says to his cavalry units, do not attack until I give you the signal. No matter what, you have to stay back. The signal is 6 calls on the bugle. We're going to hit this bugle 6 times, then you charge. All right. So what happens is this. As expected, Saladin launches his light cavalry and his infantry against the Crusaders. What the Crusaders do is they have this group of infantry here, and they're actually walking backwards. And there are spearmen and shieldmen here with crossbowmen behind. And what they're doing is they are walking like this, and they're firing. Can someone get the door, please? And they're firing like this, walking backwards. Now, the crossbows that the Crusaders are using are better than the little short bows that the Saracens are using. Right? The Saracens are excellent horse archers. They really are really good. But even they realized that a lot of these guys were walking around with arrows stuck in their armor because the arrows just didn't have that puncturing ability that they needed in order to get through any type of armor. And so these guys, walking backwards, behind spears, behind shields, could pick off these guys. And so this was an effective tactic if you could keep them together. However, these arrows are finding targets. The javelins that they're throwing are finding targets. These guys are getting tired. And quite frankly, from the day they took off to this day, September 7th, they have been under attack almost daily. And so they're getting hurt, they're getting wounded, people are tired. These guys are getting frustrated, but they're doing a good job. They're maintaining order. Richard's keeping them together. These constant attacks are not getting these guys to charge. Saladin can't believe it. He's like, these guys should have charged already. What's keeping them from charging? What was keeping them from charging was Richard. All right? Eventually, though, something has to give. And what has to give is these guys start to lose their horses. The Knights Hospitaller are losing their horses because they're getting hit. And eventually, after getting hit with numerous arrows, horses will die. And a lot of the knights were forced then to become infantry, and they were getting frustrated. They were worried that they would lose this ability to ever counterattack. And the leader of the Hospitallers, Garnier de Nablus, is just like, we have to fight. He goes to Richard and tells Richard, we have to attack. We can't endure this. And Richard said, not yet. So what happens is this. After enduring this for hours, finally what occurs is the Knights Hospitallers say, no more. And without orders, they charged. They went through their own ranks, and they crashed into this group right here. I'm here to tell you that these guys did not expect that. It's been going on for a long time. They did not expect this attack, and they are going to be broken up. This group over here is going to start disintegrating, like that. These guys then start to move forward. So you have infantry and cavalry. The problem is, if that occurs, Saladin, this is what Saladin has been waiting for, Saladin could, with his group screened here, could charge in, and where could he go? Yeah, easily. He could sweep in here and crush right through and kill everybody. Conceivably, while these guys are engaged here, he could also sweep in here. Or he could sweep right here and get into the middle. There's a lot that Saladin could do. Richard knows this. And he says, you know what? He's got a choice. I could march my guys to Arsuf. We could be safe. Or I could support this attack. And he only has moments to do this. He's worried that these guys are going to go off chasing the enemy here, and then what's going to happen to them? They're going to get slaughtered. So Richard makes the decision to blow that bugle. And what happens is these guys attack. And when that happens, you see a breakup here. These guys start to disintegrate. What is Saladin going to do? He is, of course, going to attack. He's like, okay, we have to attack. So Saladin launches these guys into the fight. And here's what occurs. These guys press forward, and they are met with a charge by heavy cavalry. You have light cavalry, massive numbers, against heavy cavalry, and the heavy cavalry, just so you know, is more effective. Richard is going to lead this charge, and they're going to end up here with Richard at the front. All right? Very effectively. As a matter of fact, chroniclers from the Muslims said that he was just hacking his way through people, and as a matter of fact, Richard was so effective that people just started getting out of his way because they saw so many people going down to his blade. So he's scaring people. Saladin is moving forward, and he's like, wow, this isn't going like I expected. This group crushes forward, and what you see is this cavalry, mostly Mamluks, they are going to be hit simultaneously by these two crushing blows from heavy cavalry, be it Templars or Hospitallers, and it is devastating. And it's going to disrupt their cavalry. What happens is this cavalry, along with this infantry, starts to retreat. All right? And here you have this cavalry running away with the infantry. What does Richard fear?
His cavalry's going to follow him.
That his cavalry's going to follow him, and what's going to happen to his cavalry? They're going to get slaughtered. And this is almost what happens. The Hospitallers get a little bit too far. He calls them back. He calls back the Templars. He's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Get back. Get back. And they do. There's a counterattack. It was smart that Richard started pulling his men back. He pulls them back so that they have the defense of not only their infantry, but also they can't be turned because the water's there. These guys are going to counterattack again, but again, the heavy cavalry of the knights are going to turn them again. And so they're going to run. Richard kept his troops intact. He didn't allow them to go too far. Because had they gone too far, they would have just been rounded up and killed. What happens is Saladin stops. He's like, whoa, let him go. Let him go. This didn't work. Had he continued to fight, Saladin could have lost his entire army. If Richard had attempted to continue the fight, he would have lost his knights, which were the bulk of his effective army. And so what happens is a situation where Richard's army is still alive. He won this battle. Richard wins the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin is forced to flee. But he didn't have to go very far. They just kind of shadowed Richard. But here's the deal. Saladin and Richard realized that both were amazing generals. Richard can't believe how good Saladin is. And Saladin can't believe how good Richard is. They created this strange mutual trust and admiration. And Saladin is never again going to face Richard on the battlefield. He didn't want to. He's like, I'm not going to go against those guys. Richard isn't stupid. I can't trick him. And Richard is never going to be able to face Saladin because Saladin didn't want to fight him. Saladin realized he didn't have to. Saladin commenced a series of basically scorched earth campaigns. Whenever Richard would move, Saladin would destroy food sources nearby. So Richard was forced to rely on supplies from the sea, which are very difficult to get. And Richard, even when he could take Jaffa, couldn't effectively invade to get to Jerusalem because he just couldn't get the supplies he needed. And so what you have is kind of a stalemate. Richard can't take Jerusalem, that's his number one goal. Saladin can't destroy Richard. So they end up with a truce. They sign a peace treaty that lasted for 3 years. So for 3 years, there was relative peace in the Middle East, and pilgrims, Christians from Europe, were again allowed into Jerusalem, which is something that Saladin had not allowed. So what this battle did is it created a 3-year truce. It allowed Christians to go into the Holy Land. Richard I is now seen as a brilliant military commander. Saladin is, again, a brilliant military commander. The end result, however, is that the Third Crusade can't be considered a complete success because Jerusalem was not taken. Eventually what happens is Richard figures, I got to go back because Philip, the guy that left me earlier, who's the king of France, is trying to take my French territories. So Richard has to leave. He goes back to Europe to defend his territory. Unfortunately, he's killed during a siege, and so he's never able to effectively reclaim all of his territories. Saladin lives for a couple more years. I think he lives for a little more than 2 more years. He dies of a fever, and what's interesting about Saladin is when he died, he was found to have, I think it's like 13 silver pieces and 1 gold piece. Here's a guy who was really legitimately one of the richest men in the world. And what he had done just before he died is he gave all of his money away to poor people. All of it. As a matter of fact, he had no money even to have a funeral. And that's a pretty big deal. That says something about him as a person, not just as a commander. I think that's quite fascinating. Both commanders fought brilliantly. One won the battle, Richard. One won the war, Saladin. At the end of this battle, just so you know, Richard is only going to lose 700 of his men. I mean, still it's 700 men. Saladin is going to lose 7,000. So this battle, because Richard was able to keep his troops under control, and he only moved when it was cooler, he protected one of his flanks, and he protected his food, and he said to these guys, his best warriors, his mounted knights, he said, you guys need to listen to me. Do what I say, and we'll march in order, and we'll be fine. Here's the deal. Had the Hospitallers not attacked, right, there's a good chance that this battle could have ended the war, had the Hospitallers not attacked. Because what might have happened is this plan, they reach here, they call the bugle, they could have had a simultaneous attack. They could have encircled the Muslim forces. It is possible they could have done that. But because the Hospitallers went too early, then it became a less perfect scenario. And Richard was able to do the best with what he had. Still a fascinating battle that very few people pay much attention to. Thanks, guys. Questions? Cool. Thanks.